father, and how was he involved in production for World War II in Louisiana?
My father was Lewis Price, and he was an employee with Exxon, with Standard Oil in Baton Rouge, the Exxon refinery. He actually started working for him when he was 14 years old. He lied about his age, got a job at Exxon an office boy, and by going to night school and working in the refinery, he went through various steps in the refinery. And in 1936, he graduated from LSU with an engineering degree. Now back then, Standard Oil didn't really like to have LSU degreed engineers at the Baton Rouge refinery. They'd get people from MIT and Georgia Tech and so forth. So, but they knew my dad, so they hired him, and after that they began to hire LSU engineers. By the late 1930s, he was working on several engineering processes in the plant, and he was a chemical engineer, and the two that are probably most important here is he worked on a research process or research activity on the creation of synthetic rubber, and he was also involved in the use of catalytic converters to process higher octane gasoline, and both of those products would become very important during World War II. The first one, since the Japanese cut off any access to real rubber, natural rubber, when they took over the Pacific Rim, it meant that we were going to have a synthetic rubber plant of some sort of production. And of course, the second one is fighter planes required a higher octane than any other products or any other products on the market. And so he was involved in both of those projects.
Okay. What is Standard of, you've hinted at this, but I want to go into it a little more. What did Standard Oil of Baton Rouge contribute to the success of the British Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940, before the United States even entered the war?
Well, in March of 1940, the representative of Rolls-Royce Corporation was on a commission, British commission, and he told the commission that Rolls-Royce was ready to start producing a Merlin engine that could handle 100-octane fuel, that would have more punch, more horsepower, more speed. It would give their Spitfires a better chance against the German, especially the Me-109 fighter plane. And one of the other members of the commission was with the British oil producers, and he said, "Well, this is ridiculous, because you could make the engine, but we don't have the octane. We don't have the fuel." At the time, the highest octane that they had was 87%. What little research, and the British found out that Standard Oil in Baton Rouge, the refinery here, was producing a 100-octane fuel as an experiment. They had a pilot plant in Baton Rouge that was producing a fairly small amount on a monthly basis, just to see if it would work. So under Lend-Lease, the British were able to take virtually every drop of that high-octane fuel and run them through those new Merlin engines, which gave the RAF fighters considerably more punch. I just read something the other day that said when one of their fighters went down, the Germans couldn't figure out what had happened, because they had air superiority with their Me-109 fighter planes, and the Germans were able to capture a wrecked Spitfire in France, and they discovered that the British were using 100 octane fuel, and that was the clincher. That was why they had the extra power. And the Germans were completely, in their reports, they said, "We're mystified. We don't know where the fuel comes from. We don't know how they got it, but it's given them a distinct advantage in the air." And there was only one other refinery in the world that was producing high octane fuels, 100 octane fuels, and that was in Aruba. And the British were able to start pulling fuel both from the Shell refinery in Aruba and also from Standard Oil in Baton Rouge. So Baton Rouge actually produced the first 100 octane fighter fuel of the war.
Which Shell was that in Aruba?
Dutch Royal Shell Company. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Of course, I think after the occupation of Holland, after the German occupation of Holland, the Aruba refinery was still going, so they were looking for a market for their fuels. They sure didn't want to send it to the Germans.
Yeah. All right. What did Standard Oil of Baton Rouge contribute to the success of the Allies after the United States entered the war?
Everything. They produced heavy oils for lubrication. They produced high-octane fuels, both for fighters and bombers. They produced diesel for tanks and half-tracks. They produced. They were one of the #1 targets, interestingly enough, for the Germans. During the war, the United States, the government had to set up submarine nets just south of Baton Rouge, and Ryan Field in Baton Rouge was originally a military field, and it was used, they housed both fighters, P-38s I think, and the sort of progenitor of the SBD, the plane that would be used by the U.S. Navy to drop torpedoes that were set up to drop depth charges, and they actually sank submarines. I don't know if that's quite the way to put it with submarines, but they actually sank submarines in the Mississippi River. The subs would hide out around in the swamp around Whiskey Bay and down in the Mississippi Delta and try to fire on U.S. shipping coming out of the port of Baton Rouge, carrying fuels and other supplies first to the British and then to us.
Okay. What about Standard Oil's production of synthetic rubber was important beyond the fact that the real thing was not available? You indicated to me the other day that the synthetic rubber that Standard Oil was producing was superior to that being made in Germany.
Well, the synthetic oils had been, or I'm sorry, synthetic rubbers had been produced for nearly 20 years in both the United States and Germany, but it was of a very, very inferior grade, and the biggest problem with it was it couldn't handle extreme cold or extreme heat, and in the early 30s, the U.S. government, or Standard Oil and German chemical company called IG Farben made an alliance to try to produce a new kind of synthetic rubber called Buna, B-U-N-A rubber, and the United States was going to use use extractions from crude oil to make the rubber. The Germans, who didn't have access to a lot of crude oil, were going to use coal oil. They had decided that they had abundant coal, so they would use coal oil. And the real problem in producing this rubber was that they had difficulty, both companies, using oil or coal. They had difficulty trying to create a rubber that could handle high altitude and extreme cold. Past about 0 Fahrenheit, they would start to have trouble with the rubber. It would crack, and at even lower temperatures, it would actually just break. It would become essentially a solid. And when the United States entered the war, well, in 1939, when people began to realize some of the horrible things that were happening in Germany, some members of Congress found out that IG Farben was using slave labor. And these guys didn't like Rockefeller very much, so they created a conspiracy theory that Rockefeller was helping the German war machine by being involved in this partnership. Now, there are all kinds of American companies that had all kinds of research partnerships with German companies, but they didn't have Rockefeller in them.
Yeah.
So when Germany and England went to war, the Standard Oil separated themselves from Farben, and then and of course they had a vast number of German patents that they couldn't use after they broke this connection. But then there were a series of hearings to find out the extent to which Standard Oil was involved with Farben, and if Standard Oil knew what Farben was doing, and at that point, FDR stepped in, and he said, we need these products. He said at the point when we severed our connection with Germany, then all of these patents became the property of Standard Oil, the German patents, and then Standard Oil could use their research and use their protected material, and by about 1942, after we had entered the war, the research team, a group of research teams, several different rubber companies and Standard Oil, were able to create a new kind of rubber based on something called butadiene. And this new rubber could stand temperatures down to minus 40 degrees and even lower. It could stand heats up past 115, 120, 160 degrees, which means it could be used for tires and tubing, airplane tires and rubber tubing, pretty much anywhere. And the Germans were never able to, I suspect because they were using coal oil instead of crude oil, they were never able to perfect this process, which meant that they had difficulty with using synthetic fuels all the way through the war. And in fact, the worst problem they had was in their eastern campaigns, when they would have to fight at temperatures far below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And if they tried to land planes under those circumstances, the wheels would just explode, would just break to pieces. And if the lubricants they were using couldn't handle those low temperatures either. So imagine cleaning your rifle with a solid. That's basically the problem.
How much of that work was done at Standard Oil in Baton Rouge?
You know, I know that my father was involved in the research, but it was really a shared job. But once they had conquered the problems, once they had taken care of all the difficulties, I know the Baton Rouge refinery produced an enormous amount of this rubber, huge quantities of it, and I'm not sure if there were any other production companies like Goodrich that had the production facilities that Standard Oil did. Standard Oil became, well, the refinery in Baton Rouge was already one of the largest refineries in the United States. By the time the war was over, it was the largest refinery in the United States.
Well, they produced just a staggering amount of the airplane fuel that was used.
Yeah, and in fact, the production was, the demand for production was so high that they created literally another whole refinery to deal with high octane fuels. And after the war, I think it's after the war, that part of the refinery formed a corporation of its own, broke off from Exxon and formed a corporation of its own called Ethel.
Yeah, I remember Ethel. You've addressed this to some extent already, but how did World War II affect Standard Oil in Baton Rouge? We've talked about how Standard Oil affected the war. How did the war affect Standard Oil?
Well, I think the war, as I said a few minutes ago, it turned it into the largest refinery in the United States and one of the largest in the world. It would also, in terms of the internal politics of Standard Oil, once upon a time, before World War II, and there was even a continuing bias there into the 60s, or the early 60s. Once upon a time, there were refineries, Exxon refineries all over, Esso, I guess back then, refineries all over the United States. But the real talent at those refineries, and most of the research that was being done at Florham Park in New Jersey. They're called Esso Research and Engineering, ER&E. And the sort of standing prejudice among the leadership within Exxon Corporation was that, you know, this is where the talent is. This is where the research takes place. And everything else simply follows that lead and produces the goods that they perfect. And I think the fact that so much research was done in Baton Rouge made the Baton Rouge refinery and the folks who worked, the engineers who worked at Baton Rouge, sort of the second luminaries within the company. And that's kind of important because in the 1950s, late 1950s, Esso began to have refineries all over the world. and they used talent not only from ER&E in New Jersey, but also from Baton Rouge. My father was, well, I had a sister who had polio, and we had to stay in Baton Rouge for her, and she passed away in 1957. And my father had already turned down 2 or 3 foreign assignments, and the sort of the rule was when you turn one down, you never get offered again. But they offered him an assignment to work at a startup in a refinery in Fawley in England, in the New Forest area of southern England. And he didn't have anything to keep him here, and I think my parents both wanted to get out of the country for a while, go do something different. So he was involved in that startup. And from that point on, from 1957 or 58 up until 1968, he was involved in every European startup in Europe, SO startup. And when he went, he would always bring process folks, people who worked in the Baton Rouge refinery with him. There were 6 or 8 people that would sort of follow him from one country to the next. And so he ended his career with 50 years of service with Exxon at 65, and at that point he was a gas plant manager in Libya. So he spent a tremendous. But I guess what I'm saying is, Baton Rouge became part of that international, the growth of international corporations because there was enough talent here.
The brain trust.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, one second, Ben. Can I get you to just you're kind of leaning out?
Oh, okay. How's that?
That's good.
You mentioned that your father was one of the first LSU graduates to be hired there, and that it's sort of that was kind of a transition and a prejudice against local.
Yeah. Well, I think Southerners in general.
Yeah. Did the war significantly increase the number of Louisianians from LSU, from Louisiana Tech, working at Standard Oil?
I'm afraid I really don't know.
Okay.
I assume that's probably the case, because as they expanded, as the refinery in Baton Rouge expanded, they needed more and more personnel to take over those jobs and do the research. So I think even still, though, they were hiring. Most of their hires came from northeastern colleges, northeastern universities.
Well, that wasn't one of my questions, but it came up in response to what you said. One last thing. A lot of the folks I've talked to for this project have had comments about how their fathers reacted when the war ended. Did your father have a particular reaction to that you recall?
No.
I'm sure he must have been proud of his work.
Oh yeah. Of course, unfortunately, the stuff that he was doing was classified. So he would come. My mother used to say he'd come home in the afternoon. She'd say, "Well, what did you do today?" And he'd say, "Well, I drank coffee. I went out and had lunch with Elmer and Cy. But he was actually not allowed to discuss the work they were doing with anybody. And of course, when the war was over, he stayed he continued to work primarily in his specialty was catalytic crackers, and he actually designed one. I just happened to see the patent online the other day, and he continued to do that kind of work at Exxon until '58 when we went overseas, and that's what he was doing startups on for the first part of his career.
Was he involved in the one that they built right at the beginning of the war? Because Jerry talks in his book about.
Well, he was involved in the research for a new kind of cat cracker, and he was involved in the building of that pilot plant, because catalytic crackers is how you manage to get the higher octane fuels. In 52 or 53, 51, I remember because that's the year I was born. Apparently he had 2 strokes of luck, me, and also his patent was accepted for a new kind of furnace to run catalytic crackers, and those furnaces were actually built. One of the reasons they sent him overseas was because those were the kinds of cat crackers that were being built over there.
When did he become able to talk about this?
I don't know. He was 90 years old when he began to talk to me about it.
Wow.
So I'm sure at some point probably in the late 50s he was able to.
So towards the cooling off.
Yeah.
That's the wrong word, but the amelioration of the Cold War, I guess.
Yeah.
He was able to be.
Yeah. Of course, you know that during the Cold War, Baton Rouge was one of the top 3 targets on the Soviet hit list.
I do remember that.
That's why we were
Not very fondly, but
that's why we were told, how to duck and cover underneath our desks when the big one came. When you see the flash.
right. Just like the turtle.
That's right.
All right.
Yeah.
That's good stuff, man. That's great.
Oh, thanks.
And this happens every time I do this. Not only did you tell me what I wanted to know, but you mentioned some things that are going to fit into places that I didn't even think about.
Oh, good.
Like the story about your dad coming home and not being able
To talk about what he was doing, yeah.
We do a little segment on the loose lip sink ships.
The reason he actually began to talk to me about this was in the late 90s, sometime in the 90s, the folks who had still been involved on these research projects began to get together and meet at Frank's in Baton Rouge and have breakfast. And there were, I think, about 10 or 12 of them. And then by the time Dad passed away in 2000, there were 2. So they had been just sort of dying off as a process, actually from the early 90s
Right.
all the way to 2000. And he was, I think when he passed away, he was the last man standing.
So you got the benefit.
Well, and I asked him, who these folks were that he had breakfast with once a week, and he said, well, and then he told me the whole story. It was 2 separate projects, but several of them worked together on both projects. So that's how I found out about it.
Band of brothers.
Yeah, yeah.